Before banks or stock markets, before coins bore kings' faces, there was gold. And nowhere on earth did it shine brighter than in West Africa. The story of gold is usually told through the vaults of Europe, the mines of the Americas, or the means of ancient empires. But long before any of those chapters began, Africa was already writing its own golden legacy. It wasn't just a continent that had gold, it was the place that gave gold meaning, weight, and value. In the golden desert stretching across the Sahel, in the manuscripts of Timbuktu wrapped in faded script and secrets, in the long winding caravans threading the Sahara, there existed a world where wealth meant more than currency. It meant connection, civilization, power. Picture this: the glint of sunlight on a merchant's gold scales in the market of Kumbi Saleh. The rustle of robes embroidered with Saharan dust as scholars gather beneath the mud brick walls of Timbuktu's mosques. The soft pad of camel hooves on ancient sand routes that stretched from the forest kingdoms of West Africa to the bustling bazaars of North Africa. This was a world not just of trade, but of ideas. A civilization built not simply on what gold could buy, but on what gold could build. This is not a tale of treasure. It is a tale of transformation. The gold that flowed from West Africa reshaped cities thousands of miles away. It underwrote the economies of empires, fueled the ambitions of sultans and kings, and whispered into the ears of European explorers who would chase its glimmer into lands they did not understand. It lifted some to godlike heights and brought others to their knees. But at its heart, this isn't a story about metal. It's a story about meaning. About how Africa didn't just possess the gold the world wanted. It set the standard for what that gold was worth. This is the beginning of that story. A story too often buried, too rarely told. One where Africa was not the hunted, but the origin. Not the backdrop, but the brilliance. The world would chase Africa's gold, and in that chase, history itself would be rewritten. In the beginning, there was Wagadou, the first golden kingdom. Founded around the 4th century CE in what is now southeastern Mauritania and western Mali, this kingdom would later become known by a name the world would remember: Ghana. But Ghana was never the name of the land. It was the title of its ruler, the king, the warrior chief, the supreme authority who reigned over a land so rich in gold, it seemed as if the earth itself bled wealth. The people called it Wagadou, the land of gold. And it lived up to that name in every way. Wagadou was not a mirage or a legend. It was a well-organized empire with military strength, political sophistication, and economic power. Its rise was rooted in geography as much as strategy. Positioned at the edge of the Sahara, it became the central artery through which goods moved between North Africa and the forested regions of the south. The trans-Saharan trade routes were its lifeblood, and Ghana controlled them with absolute authority. From the 7th century onward, camel caravans brought salt, cloth, copper, and horses from the north and returned carrying gold dust, ivory, kola nuts, and enslaved individuals. The Ghanaian kings placed heavy taxes on these goods, growing ever wealthier as trade flourished. At the heart of this empire stood Kumbi Saleh, a city of dual identities. One half was the seat of the king, a sacred and secluded palace surrounded by courtiers, advisors, and warriors. The other half was a bustling metropolis of markets, mosques, and traders from across the Islamic world. Arab historians who visited or heard of Kumbi Saleh marveled at its structure. It was said that gold dust was so common in its marketplaces that it was traded almost like vegetables. the king maintained strict control over the gold supply, owning all gold nuggets, allowing only dust to circulate. A clever economic policy that maintained scarcity, preserved value, and demonstrated Ghana's sovereignty over its greatest resource. This control over gold made Ghana a political force beyond its borders. North African merchants and Muslim diplomats spoke of the king with awe, describing his grand court, his wealth, and the justice of his administration. And yet, Ghana was not an Islamic kingdom. It remained traditionally African in its religion and culture for most of its existence, while allowing Muslim merchants to operate freely within its cities. This duality, open yet sovereign, spiritual yet pragmatic, was part of what made Ghana so resilient and so respected. But gold is not a silent treasure. It speaks, and its voice travels far beyond the mines where it sleeps. As Ghana grew, so did the envy of its neighbors and the ambitions of those who wished to control the same trade routes. Internal fractures, combined with external pressures, began to shake the foundations of the kingdom. The Almoravid incursions in the 11th century, combined with climate change and the shifting of trade routes, gradually weakened Ghana's dominance. By the 12th century, Wagadou began to fade, its name echoing in the gold that continued to pass through the hands of new rulers. And yet, Ghana's legacy wouldn't die. It had lit a torch, proving that African kingdoms could master global trade, could govern vast territories, and could define the value of the world's most precious metal. The hunger it awakened in the wider world would not be satisfied. Its fall would not bring silence, it would spark a new golden age. But even the richest kingdom cannot silence the hunger of the world. When Ghana fell, its gold called forth another empire. When Ghana's golden echo began to fade, a new empire rose from its ashes, larger, wealthier, and destined to shake the foundations of the world's imagination. In the 13th century, the Empire of Mali emerged as the dominant power in West Africa, founded by a visionary leader named Sundiata Keita. He was more than a conqueror. He was a unifier, a storyteller, a lawmaker. Under his leadership, the Manden region, a cluster of clans and territories, was brought together through a sacred charter known as the Kurukan Fuga, one of the oldest oral constitutions in human history. This was not just an empire built on force. It was built on principles of justice, unity, and communal balance, a spiritual and political architecture as solid as its economic foundations. And those foundations were gold. Mali controlled the three most important gold-producing regions of the era: Bambuk, Bure, and Galam. These mines supplied nearly 2/3 of the world's gold during Mali's peak, a staggering concentration of wealth that no other empire on earth could rival. Unlike other kingdoms where gold was a luxury, in Mali it was a national lifeblood. Caravans flowed in and out of Mali's trade cities, especially during the dry season when the desert was most navigable. Salt came south from the Sahara, textiles and horses came from the north, and gold traveled in the opposite direction, bound for markets in Cairo, Tunis, and beyond. At the heart of this thriving trade network were cities like Timbuktu and Gao. More than trade hubs, these were intellectual beacons, global centers of scholarship, religion, and culture. Timbuktu, in particular, stood as a symbol of African enlightenment. Its famous university, Sankore, attracted students and scholars from across the Islamic world. Manuscripts covering subjects from astronomy to theology to medicine were copied and traded like precious gems. This was not a city of gold alone, it was a city of ideas, funded by the wealth of the earth but elevated by the wisdom of the mind. And then came Mansa Musa, the man who would etch Mali's name into global consciousness. Crowned in the early 14th century, Musa inherited an empire already rich. But under his reign, Mali became legendary. In 1324, he undertook a pilgrimage to Mecca that would ripple across continents. His procession was so grand, so opulent, that it stunned every city along its path. He traveled with tens of thousands of attendants, hundreds of camels, and countless kilograms of pure gold. In Cairo, he gave away so much of it that local economies were destabilized for years. Inflation surged, markets collapsed. The value of gold itself shifted, not because of war or policy, but because of the generosity of one African king. That pilgrimage made Mansa Musa the most talked about ruler of his time. Arab historians recorded his journey in awe. European cartographers etched his likeness into the Catalan Atlas of 1375, one of the most important maps of the medieval world. There he is, seated on a throne in the heart of Africa, wearing a golden crown, holding a golden scepter, and in his other hand a golden orb. Not as a myth, not as a symbol, but as a statement. The richest man in history was African. Europe drew his face on maps, not as a myth, but as proof that the richest man in history was African. But his gold did more than dazzle. It changed the world's imagination. After Musa's pilgrimage, tales of Mali's boundless wealth spread like wildfire. In distant lands, stories began to circulate of cities where streets sparkled with dust and kings bathed in gold. This was not yet the legend of El Dorado, but it was its spark. The idea that somewhere beyond the horizon there existed a land so rich, so luminous, that it could redefine destiny. European explorers would later sail west chasing gold, but they had first heard its siren song from the deserts of Africa. And yet, Musa was more than a symbol of wealth. He was a builder of institutions, a patron of faith and learning. He commissioned mosques, supported scholars, and sent emissaries across the Islamic world. His reign left behind not just an economic legacy, but a cultural and spiritual one. A vision of Africa as a center of civilization, where gold did not simply buy power, but fueled enlightenment. In the Empire of Mali, gold was never just a commodity. It was a catalyst. It built schools and sanctuaries. It drew maps and shifted markets. It shattered myths and created new ones. It made kings and rewrote history. This was not a land of myth. This was a land of mastery. And the world would never forget the moment it crossed paths with the empire of gold. Gold has always stirred the imagination of the world, but in the case of West Africa, it did more than inspire. It altered the course of global economics. From the royal courts of Andalusia to the crowded marketplaces of Nice, the gold that flowed out of Ghana and Mali reshaped power structures, bankrolled empires, and sparked a fevered dream of infinite wealth that would haunt European minds for centuries. This wasn't just precious metal. It was the pulse of a new economy. An economy in which Africa and not Europe held the keys. The gold that left Africa by camel caravan didn't stay in the sands. It made its way across the Sahara into North Africa, where cities like Cairo, Tunis, and Fez became financial juggernauts. These weren't just trade stops. They were cosmopolitan centers of scholarship, politics, and commerce, sustained in part by the constant influx of African gold. In Cairo, Mansa Musa's 1324 pilgrimage left such an impression that the city's economy spiraled into a decade-long inflation. The value of gold plummeted, not because of war or conquest, but because of one man's generosity. That single act proved what many already knew. West Africa wasn't just participating in global trade, it was driving it. In Tunis and Fez, African gold flowed through the hands of Berber merchants and into the vaults of Islamic caliphates. It funded the construction of mosques, the writing of books, and the expansion of scientific knowledge during the Islamic Golden Age. Across the Mediterranean, European economies still reeling from the decline of the Roman Empire found lifelines in African gold. Venice, one of the most powerful city-states in Europe, relied heavily on gold from Africa to mint its ducats, coins that became a dominant currency in Mediterranean trade. Without African gold, the economic recovery of Europe following the Dark Ages might have taken a drastically different path. Africa wasn't on the periphery of the economic map. It was the wellspring. But as European kingdoms grew stronger and more desperate for power, something shifted. Gold was no longer just a traded commodity. It became an obsession. And with obsession came myth. Arab and African chroniclers had long spoken of the abundance of gold in West Africa, of rulers like Musa and the grandeur of Timbuktu. But by the time these stories reached European ears, they had twisted into something more fantastical. There were now whispers of rivers flowing with gold, of cities built entirely from it, of kings who bathed in molten treasure. These stories did not begin in the jungles of South America. The myth of El Dorado, the city of gold, did not emerge from the Andes. It was born in the golden silence of Mali, shaped by the glimmering legends of Ghana, and whispered into the dreams of European sailors. Portuguese explorers, some of the first to round the coast of West Africa, came not just seeking trade but seeking proof of the fabled wealth they had heard about in merchant tales and monastery manuscripts. Their journals are filled with references to the golden lands, places untouched by European conquest, where fortunes awaited beneath the soil and in the palaces of dark-skinned kings. Africa's gold didn't just influence markets, it rewrote maps. It changed how Europe viewed the world. Suddenly, Africa was no longer a distant unknown. It was a destination, a treasure chest, a fantasy to be conquered. But that fantasy would come at a cost. For now, in the 14th and 15th centuries, Africa still held the upper hand. Its gold was still sovereign. Its wealth was still protected. But the hunger it inspired in the hearts of the world's rising empires would soon turn from awe to ambition, and from ambition to invasion. The world's desire for gold began with admiration, but it would soon become something far more dangerous. In the heart of Mali's golden empire, far from the roar of battle or the glitter of markets, there was a city where wealth wore a different face. Its name was Timbuktu, a name that still carries the weight of mystery, often whispered as a metaphor for the farthest corners of the earth. But for centuries, Timbuktu was not a place of exile or myth. It was a center of gravity, a lighthouse of learning in a world still struggling to define the edges of its own maps. And at its core was truth that defied the expectations of empire. In Mali, gold did not only build walls, it built mines. Timbuktu's rise was no accident. Its location along the Niger River and the trans-Saharan trade routes made it a natural hub for commerce. But it was the empire's deliberate investment in education and culture that transformed it into something more profound. Here, gold was not hoarded in vaults or melted into crowns. It was poured into schools, libraries, and the lives of scholars who came from as far as Cairo, Mecca, and Morocco to teach and to learn. Knowledge was not a luxury, it was currency, and its exchange was constant. At the height of its intellectual power, Timbuktu housed over 700,000 manuscripts. These were not mere religious texts. They included treatises on astronomy, law, medicine, philosophy, agriculture, ethics, and mathematics. Entire libraries were passed down through generations of families, some of which still exist today, hidden in earthen homes and secret rooms, protected through centuries of turmoil and silence. In these manuscripts, the stars were charted with accuracy that rivaled their European counterparts. Human anatomy was studied, legal codes were debated, spiritual principles were explored through logic, language, and poetic metaphor. Timbuktu was not just copying the world's knowledge, it was creating it. The University of Sankore, along with the madrasas of Sidi Yahya and Jingere Bay, formed a triad of higher learning that rivaled any of its time. Students enrolled in years-long studies undergoing rigorous oral examinations and debates. There were entrance standards, graduated degrees, and public scholarly discussions. It was an academic system that would feel familiar even today, but it was driven by a deeper purpose, not merely to educate but to elevate, to cultivate wisdom that could serve both the soul and society. What made this spiritual economy so unique was its intentional link between wealth and enlightenment. The rulers of Mali, especially Mansa Musa, understood that the empire's strength did not lie only in its mines or its armies. True legacy came from the knowledge its gold could unlock. While much of Europe was still emerging from medieval superstition, Timbuktu was engaging in global intellectual dialogue. Its scholars debated questions of metaphysics and jurisprudence that echoed the complexity of ancient Greece or classical Islam. Its wealth was not a weapon, it was a tool, and its sharpest edge was education. Even the architecture of Timbuktu reflected this fusion of material and intellectual wealth. The mosques of the city, built from mud and wood, were adorned with wooden beams, not as decoration, but as spiritual markers, measuring time and guiding energy. The very buildings pulsed with memory. They stood as monuments not to conquest, but to contemplation. And in all of these, we are reminded that the true power of gold lies not in what it can buy, but in what it can build. In Mali, that meant building minds, building moral codes, building communities rooted in learning and reverence. But where gold created light, it also cast shadows. For the same caravans that brought scholars and scrolls would one day carry different cargo. The very fame that elevated Timbuktu to legend would soon place it in the crosshairs of empires that valued gold for power, not peace, and saw knowledge not as sacred, but as something to be looted or lost. The golden light of Timbuktu, though radiant, would not be eternal. The world was shifting, and gold was once again about to change hands and change history. Gold, once a symbol of enlightenment and sacred value in Mali, began to attract not just admiration, but conquest. As its fame spread beyond Africa, a hunger followed, one that would prove insatiable. The same substance that built mosques, funded libraries, and illuminated minds became the very thing that drew destruction to the empires that had wielded it so wisely. The story of African gold shifted from one of internal strength to one of external obsession. And that obsession would unravel kingdoms. North African powers were among the first to move from trade to takeover. For centuries, Arab and Berber merchants had maintained profitable relationships with the Ghanaian and Malian empires. But by the late 15th and 16th centuries, the mood began to change. The desire was no longer simply to access gold through diplomacy, it was to control its source. In 1591, this shift culminated in a direct invasion by the Saadian dynasty of Morocco, targeting the weakening remnants of the Songhai Empire, which had risen to dominate the region after Mali's decline. Armed with gunpowder, cannons, and firearms, technology that Songhai forces had little defense against, the Moroccans crossed the Sahara in an ambitious military campaign. Their goal was clear: seize the gold fields, control the trade routes, and dominate the region economically. The decisive battle at Tondibi
saw the collapse of Songhai's military might. Cities like Timbuktu and Gao were ransacked. The scholarly communities that had defined the spiritual economy of Mali were scattered or silenced. The manuscripts of Timbuktu, once read under the desert stars, were now buried for protection or lost to time. Morocco would fail to hold the territory long term, but the damage was done. West Africa's golden age was fractured, not by internal decay alone, but by external force. As the old trans-Saharan routes grew more perilous and politically unstable, trade began to shift, not north across the desert, but west toward the Atlantic. European powers, especially Portugal, had begun exploring the West African coast in the 15th century. They built forts, negotiated with coastal kingdoms, and started tapping into the same gold streams that once flowed through Mali and Songhai. But their ambitions didn't stop at minerals. As gold became harder to extract and political tensions disrupted inland networks, Europeans turned to a different form of wealth: human bodies. The Atlantic slave trade was born from the same hunger that once fueled the gold rush. European traders began exchanging guns, alcohol, and goods for enslaved Africans, often with the cooperation of local rulers pressured by shifting power dynamics and foreign weaponry. The coastlines that once exported gold dust and ivory became points of departure for millions of stolen lives. The sacred value of gold, once used to elevate minds and build cathedrals of knowledge, was now entangled in the buying and selling of people. It was here that gold's greatest betrayal was revealed, when its value on foreign markets outweighed the values of humanity itself. Kings who once wore gold to signify cosmic alignment were now forced to use it to buy survival. Kingdoms fractured, trust dissolved, and as European empires grew rich on African resources, African societies were systematically destabilized. The same gold that once illuminated the world now cast its darkest shadow. When gold became currency, people became collateral. The fall of Mali and Songhai was not the end of Africa's story, but it marked a violent turning point. What began as sacred, sovereign, and transformative was now a target. The world that had once come to Africa seeking trade now came for control. And in their pursuit of gold, they ripped apart the very societies that had taught them its value in the first place. The cost of Africa's gold was no longer counted in coins, it was counted in lives. The gold may have changed hands, the empires may have crumbled, but the echo remains. Today, the legacy of West Africa's golden age still homes beneath the surface of our global systems. In the economies we depend on, the currencies we exchange, and the art that still carries a glimmer of that sacred shine. African gold, once the engine of empires, continues to power modern finance in quieter but equally profound ways. It rests today not just in vaults, but in the circuitry of global trade, the symbols of wealth, and the foundations of digital commerce. Gold remains a global standard, and West Africa, particularly Mali and Ghana, remains among the richest mineral regions on Earth. In Ghana, modern mines continue to produce hundreds of tons of gold annually, making it one of the top exporters of the mineral worldwide. In Mali, despite political and economic challenges, gold remains a vital part of national revenue, still drawn from some of the same veins that enriched ancient kings. But the story is no longer just about wealth extraction. The modern era has ushered in a new conversation about ownership, equity, and remembrance. Communities are asking, who profits from this gold today? And can the wealth of the land finally return to the hands of its rightful heirs? This shift isn't only economic, it's cultural. Across the diaspora and across the continent, the image of African gold is no longer confined to myth or memory. Artists, musicians,
historians and filmmakers are reclaiming that legacy, not to glorify materialism, but to restore meaning, to remind the world that there was once a time when wealth was sacred, when gold didn't serve greed, but greatness, when it built mines, healed communities, and illuminated a continent the world chose to forget. The idea that wealth can be ethical, that it can coexist with spirituality, justice, and communal wisdom, is a deeply African philosophy. For the ancestors, gold was never just about accumulation. It was about alignment with the cosmos, with the community, with the self. Kings wore it not just to rule, but to reflect the light of those they served. Temples adorned it not just to dazzle, but to signal a sacred harmony. This concept, while once buried under centuries of conquest and colonization, is now rising again in conversations about reparations, restorative economics, and cultural pride. In a digital age obsessed with cryptocurrencies and shifting value systems, the story of African gold offers a grounding reminder. True wealth is not measured in quantity, but in legacy. It is not in the glitter of coins, but in the enduring glow of what those coins were meant to do: build, elevate, connect. That's why Timbuktu still matters. Why Mansa Musa's name still echoes through textbooks and timelines. Why the image of African royalty, once erased from global memory, now reemerges with defiance and pride. Because gold once built empires. Now, memory must build meaning. To understand how gold changed the world is to understand how Africa shapes it. It is to admit that global finance has African roots, that the age of exploration was born of African dreams, that the modern world, and with all its banking systems, luxury markets, and symbols of wealth, was in many ways built upon the riches of Mali and Ghana. This isn't just a story of the past, it's a mirror. A reminder that the future we build now can learn from the values once held in the golden cities of the Sahel, where knowledge was currency, where justice guided leadership, and where gold, for all its power, was never greater than the people who held it. Gold once built empires. Now memory must build meaning. The empire of gold was never only about metal. It was about brilliance. The brilliance of people who knew that the greatest wealth was wisdom, unity, and name. In Ghana, in Mali, in the great halls of Timbuktu, and the gold-laced silence of the Sahel, gold was not simply a resource to be mined. It was a reflection of divine order, a tool for enlightenment, and a symbol of leadership bound by responsibility. These were civilizations that understood that true power is not held in vaults, but carried in vision. The vision to build cities where ideas thrived, to forge laws guided by morality, and to leave behind legacies that would outlast any coin. And though time passed, and the gold changed hands, though greed replaced generosity, and conquest replaced curiosity, the brilliance remained. It remained in the manuscripts buried beneath desert floors, in the songs passed from griots to generations, and in the memory of a continent that once defined the value of the world's most precious element. This is more than history. It is reclamation. It is truth recovered, dignity remembered, and greatness restored. The empire of gold was real, not just in economy, but in purpose, not just in power, but in principle. If this story reminded you that Africa shaped the world, then let this be the beginning of something bigger. Like this video so the algorithm pushes it to every screen it needs to reach. Comment with your thoughts, your ancestry, or what moved you most. Share this with someone who still believes Africa's history begins with chains. And subscribe to History Store. because the story continues and we're only just beginning to tell it.